Sarah had always liked living in her little basement apartment. It wasn't fancy, and the view from her only window was just a narrow strip of gravel and patchy grass beneath the building's front yard. But it was quiet. The rent was cheap, the neighborhood felt safe. And after a long day at her job at the bookstore, she liked nothing more than curling up with a blanket and letting the low hum of the outside world lull her to sleep. That January, winter had settled in heavy and cold. The streets outside were empty by nightfall, and the sound of rain tapping on the glass became her favorite part of the day. It made the place feel smaller, cozier, like the rest of the world had been shut out. It was a little after 1 in the morning when Sarah stirred awake, unsure why she'd woken up. The rain was still falling, steady and soft. She adjusted her blanket, letting her eyes close again. And then she heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, even, deliberate. Her first thought was that something had fallen against the glass, maybe a bit of trash blowing around in the wind. But the taps didn't sound random. They were spaced too perfectly, as if someone was intentionally knocking. She stayed perfectly still, staring at the curtain that covered the window. Maybe it was nothing, she told herself, but she'd lived there for 2 years, and there were no trees anywhere near her window. There was nothing that could have brushed against it like that. Another tap came, sharper this time, closer. She could feel her pulse quickening. Her phone was on the nightstand, just inches away. She reached toward it slowly and froze. The tapping stopped. The silence that replaced it was somehow worse, thick and heavy, as though the air in the room had changed. Then came a new sound, a soft, slow creak, the unmistakable sound of a floorboard under weight. And it wasn't coming from outside. Sarah's stomach turned cold. Her apartment was small, a single bedroom, a narrow living room, a tiny kitchen. If someone was in here, there weren't many places for them to be. The sound had come from the direction of the front door, meaning whoever it was between her and her only exit. She thought about calling out, yelling something like, "Who's there?" But she didn't want to give away exactly where she was. The glow of the street lamp outside the curtain was her only light. Every shadow in the room seemed sharper now, darker. Her breaths came shallow and quiet as she tried to think. Her phone, and her only link to the outside world, was across the room, sitting on her desk. To get to it, she'd have to leave her bed and cross the open space between. She slid out from under the blanket, moving as slowly as she could. Her bare feet touched the cold floor, and she winced at the thought that even the smallest noise might give her away. She crouched low, inching toward the desk, every tiny movement feeling like it took an eternity. Halfway across, she heard it again. Another creak, this time closer. She froze, her eyes darting to the bedroom door. It was open just enough for her to see the dark sliver of the hallway beyond, empty, or at least it looked that way. Her knees ached from holding herself still. She counted to 3 in her head, then made the final move to the desk. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the phone. She dialed 911, pressing it close to her ear and whispering into the receiver. She told the operator she thought someone was inside her apartment. The woman on the other end kept her voice calm, asking where Sarah was hiding, telling her to stay where she was and remain quiet. Sarah's breathing was loud in her own ears, each second stretching longer than the last. Then the operator's tone changed. It wasn't dramatic, but Sarah caught it immediately, the shift from professional reassurance to something sharper, more urgent. "Ma'am," the voice asked quietly, "you said you live alone, right?" Sarah's throat was dry. "Yes," she whispered. "Why?" The reply made her skin crawl. "You need to get out of the apartment right now. The call you're making, it's coming from your landline." For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't think. Her landline phone was in the kitchen, right next to the living room, and if that phone had been picked up, someone had been in her apartment long before she'd even heard the tapping. She bolted for the bedroom window, yanking the curtain aside. The rain was still falling in sheets, the gravel outside slick and shining in the light. She unlocked the frame and shoved it upward, crawling out into the cold night without looking back. When the police arrived minutes later, they searched the apartment but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints on the wet gravel outside her window. The only thing they noted was the landline phone, still resting on the kitchen counter. The receiver was slightly off its cradle, as though someone had set it down in a hurry. Sarah moved out a week later. She never found out who had been inside that night, or how they got in. Jake had been driving long-haul trucks for nearly a decade, and in that time he'd seen almost everything the road could throw at him. Brutal storms, near misses with reckless drivers, and more than a few strange sights late at night. But nothing ever stuck with him quite like what happened one foggy evening in October. He was hauling a load through a rural stretch of highway in the Pacific Northwest. The kind of place where the towns were little more than clusters of houses and the gas stations closed hours before the sun went down. The road wound between dense pine forests, their tops lost in the mist that had been rolling in since sunset. The fog was thick enough that Jake had to slow down, leaning forward over the wheel, his headlights barely cutting 30 feet ahead. It was just after midnight, and he hadn't seen another car in nearly an hour. He was fighting the weight of exhaustion, the steady hum of the tires on the asphalt and the monotony of the road pulling him toward drowsiness. That's when he saw her. A figure appeared in the glow of his headlights, a woman standing on the narrow shoulder of the road, her back to the forest. She wore a pale coat, the hood pulled up, and her hair spilling out in messy strands. One arm was raised, thumb out, the universal sign for a ride. Jake slowed, more out of surprise than anything else. It was the middle of nowhere, and the temperature outside was near freezing. He figured she must be stranded. Maybe her car had broken down somewhere behind her. He rolled to a stop just ahead of her and leaned over to crank open the passenger side door. "You need a lift?" he called out. The woman didn't answer right away. She stepped closer, her face still shadowed by the hood. When she finally looked up, Jake caught a glimpse of pale skin, tired eyes, and lips that barely moved as she said, "Thank you." Her voice was quiet, almost distant, like it was coming from far away. She climbed into the cab, shutting the door softly behind her. Up close, she looked young, maybe mid-20s, but there was something about her that seemed older, worn down. Her clothes were dry despite the heavy mist clinging to everything outside, and she carried no bag, no purse. Jake tried to make conversation, asking where she was headed. She gave a vague answer, "Into town," without saying which one. When he pressed for details, she only murmured that she'd know when they got close. It was an odd thing to say, but Jake figured maybe she was rattled from being stuck on the roadside. Still, something about the way she stared straight ahead, never looking at him, made the hairs on his arms stand up. They drove in silence for several miles. Every so often, Jake would glance over, expecting her to nod off or check her phone, but she just sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap. Her coat sleeve was torn at the cuff, and he noticed her nails were short and uneven, as if she'd been biting them. The fog thickened, curling around the truck like smoke. It was the kind of darkness where the world beyond the headlights simply didn't exist. Jake was just about to ask if she had family waiting for her when she suddenly said, "Here." He slowed, scanning the side of the road for a driveway or a house, but saw nothing but trees. "Are you sure?" he asked. "There's nothing out here?" The woman turned to him then, her hood slipping back just enough for him to see her eyes. They were wide, glassy, and filled with something he couldn't name. Not fear exactly, but a deep, aching sadness. "Thank you for the ride," she whispered. Before Jake could respond, she opened the door and stepped out into the fog. He leaned over, calling after her, but she was already gone. Not walking away, not slipping into the trees. Simply gone. One moment she was there, the next, the shoulder of the road was empty. No sound of footsteps, no movement in the mist. Jake sat there for several minutes, engine idling, trying to make sense of what he'd just seen. Finally, he climbed down from the cab, flashlight in hand, and searched both sides of the road. There were no footprints in the damp gravel. It was as if she'd never been there at all. When he reached the next town an hour later, he stopped at the all-night diner to shake off the unease. Over coffee, he told the waitress about the woman, describing her coat, her voice, the way she had vanished. The waitress went pale. She leaned in, lowering her voice. "You're not the first driver to pick her up," she said. "Folks around here call her Mary. She died in a car accident on that stretch of highway about 20 years ago. Some nights, she still tries to get home." Jake didn't finish his coffee. He left the diner with the uneasy feeling that somewhere out there in the fog, Mary was still waiting for her next ride. Alex had been renting the old Victorian house for just over a month when he first noticed the door. It wasn't that the door itself was unusual, plain white like the rest of the upstairs, but he could have sworn it hadn't been there when he moved in. The house was big, too big for one person, and full of odd creaks and quirks that came with its age. The landlord, a woman in her 60s named Mrs. Keating, had been quick to point out its character when he signed the lease. He hadn't cared, the rent was cheap, and he liked the idea of having space. But now, there was this door. It was at the far end of the upstairs hallway, recessed into a shadowy corner. When Alex first tried the knob, it didn't budge. Locked. He figured maybe it was a closet Mrs. Keating used for storage, though it was strange she hadn't mentioned it before. The thought nagged at him, but he didn't push it. At least not until a week later, when he was coming up the stairs late one night and heard something from behind it. It was faint, almost too soft to catch at first. A slow, deliberate scrape, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Alex froze halfway down the hall, straining to listen. The sound stopped, leaving only the heavy hush of the house. He told himself it was the pipes, or maybe the wind rattling something loose inside. Still, the image of that door lingered in his mind. The next day, curiosity got the better of him. He called Mrs. Keating, casually asking about the locked room. Her tone shifted instantly, losing its usual warmth. "Oh, that? It's nothing you need to worry about, just a storage space," she said quickly. When Alex asked if he could take a look, she cut him off. "No, it stays locked, always." That should have been the end of it. But the more he tried to ignore the room, the more it seemed to demand his attention. Over the next week, the noises came more often. Faint thumps, the occasional dragging sound, sometimes even what sounded like a slow knock. They never lasted long, but they always seemed to happen after midnight. One Friday, he woke to find the hallway colder than the rest of the house, as if a draft were leaking from under the locked door. When he knelt down to check, he saw that the faint strip of light coming from beneath it wasn't the warm yellow of a lamp. It was dim, almost gray, like the light before dawn. That night, Alex made up his mind. If Mrs. Keating wouldn't tell him what was inside, he'd find out himself. He waited until the noises started. A slow scrape, then silence, then another scrape. Heart pounding, he grabbed the set of spare keys he'd found in a kitchen drawer. One by one, he tried them in the lock. Most didn't fit. Then, with a soft metallic click, one turned. The door swung open on stiff hinges, revealing a narrow room he'd never seen before. It was completely empty. No furniture, no boxes, nothing. The walls were bare, the floor dusty except for a long, dark streak running from one corner to the center of the room. The air was colder here, enough to raise goosebumps on his arms. Alex stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The door began to swing closed behind him, and for a moment he considered propping it open, but something about the stillness made him forget. As he reached the center of the room, he noticed the streak on the floor wasn't dust at all. It was a stain, reddish-brown, old, and uneven. His stomach tightened. A sudden sound made him spin around. The door had shut completely. He reached for the knob, but it wouldn't turn. Locked again. From behind him, in the corner where the stain began, came a whisper. It was low, indistinct, almost like hearing someone speak from underwater. He stepped back, every muscle in his body screaming to get out. But the whisper grew louder, resolving into words he could finally understand. "You shouldn't be here." Alex's breath caught. The voice was right next to his ear, though the room was still empty. He pounded on the door, shouting for help, the sound echoing back at him. Then, the temperature dropped sharply, and a thin mist began to rise from the stain on the floor. Shapes formed in it. A vague figure, its face hidden, its limbs long and wrong, as though they didn't quite fit together. It drifted toward him, the whisper turning into a low, rattling breath. Alex grabbed the doorknob again, twisting it desperately. This time, it gave way. The door swinging open so suddenly he stumbled into the hall. When he turned back, the room was pitch black, the cold gone, the stain invisible in the shadows. He slammed the door and locked it with shaking hands. The next morning, Mrs. Keating showed up unannounced. Without a word, she walked upstairs, checked the door, and then turned to him with an expression that was neither anger nor surprise, just grim resignation. "I told you it stays locked," she said. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, then she left without another word. That night, Alex moved out. He didn't break the lease, didn't ask for his deposit back. He just left. Weeks later, when curiosity got the better of him, he searched the house's address online. Buried in old newspaper archives, he found an article from 30 years ago. A man had been murdered in that upstairs room, beaten and dragged to the center before dying. The killer was never caught. Alex never went back. But sometimes, late at night in his new apartment, he swears he still hears it. The scrape of something heavy being dragged across a floor, coming from behind a locked door that shouldn't be there.